My name is Riley, and I'm a 22-year-old female from the Caribbean. This story started in August of 2002. I was 8 at the time. I went on a family trip to Grenada with my dad's side of the family, and I had just returned home. My father had unfortunately not gone on the trip because he was in another country. Upon arriving home, I was told that my mom had dengue and was in pretty bad shape. My uncle Jared, who was 29 at the time, lived with us and was taking care of her while working. He was recently laid off and was working as a taxi driver, so he had a flexible schedule. Due to this, I ended up spending the rest of my vacation at my grandmother's house. I have a lot of aunts and uncles. My grandmother, my aunts Haley and Zoe, and my other uncle Brody all lived together at the time. On the night of August 28th, we got a call from my mother informing us that my uncle Jared hadn't come home. She hadn't seen him since the night of the 27th when he had brought her some Gatorade and other fluids, checked on if she was taking her medication, and told her he would be back later. He indicated that he was going to work for a little while longer and would be back in a couple of hours, but he hadn't come home at all. This was very out of character for him, especially because he knew my mom was sick. Add to it that my dad was out of the country, and it just wasn't something he would do. Our family started calling his phone and reaching out to friends and other family members to find out if anyone had heard from him, but no one had. My cousin Kylie, his daughter, was 6 at the time, and he would frequently go to see her or call her every day. He hadn't done that either. My grandmother got extremely worried after talking to Kylie's mom and realizing he hadn't called her either. We tried filing a missing persons report, but the police officers gave the whole 72-hour spiel. By the time the 30th came and there was no word from him, we knew something was dreadfully wrong. My father had returned from his trip and started looking for my uncle immediately. We speculated that maybe he was with a girlfriend that we didn't know about. Maybe he even went on an impromptu trip somewhere. But none of his clothes were missing except for what my mom saw him wearing that night, so we ruled that out. Days were dragging by. I cannot explain to you the feeling of absolute helplessness that you get when someone you love is missing. It's a desperate, sickening feeling. Even as young as I was, I felt it. Jared and I were close. I couldn't believe that he would just leave us. My mom, grandmother, and my aunts cried constantly, but I, in my own way, tried comforting them saying he was fine and that he would come home. The morning of September 1st came, and it was Sunday. My grandmother got a call from Kylie's mom, Ashley. Ashley started telling my grandmother that Kylie had a dream, and in it, Jared had told her that he was in a river, and 4 guys from Bonaire, a city in my country, had hurt him. He also told her that he loved her, and to never forget that. My aunt was really freaked out, because my cousin was 6, and she was a very shy child and never talked much. Even more, how did she even know about Bonaire? My grandmother calmed Adele down and told her she needed to be composed for Kylie's sake. We were all told about the dream, but we didn't know how to respond to it. My uncle was still missing after all. That night we got a call from my uncle's girlfriend. My family didn't know of her, but it was confirmed by a friend that she in fact was dating my uncle. My grandmother and I had a lengthy conversation with her about my uncle's disappearance, and she was genuinely worried and upset about it. She worked at a restaurant and asked if she could bring us some food. That night, teary-eyed and worried looking, she brought my family some food. I had a big family, and it wasn't a lot, but it was all she could afford, and we were very touched by the gesture. She stayed with us for a few hours and offered her information, which admittedly wasn't anything we didn't know. September 2nd came around, and it was the first day of school. My entire family felt that things should be kept normal as possible for Kylie and I, so I was sent to school, but none of them went to work. My dad had come to pick me up that day, which was highly unusual. I remember walking to him and being so confused as to why he was the one picking me up, and not my mom. As we sat in the car, he said the words that brought me so much relief that I felt myself brighten up. We found Jared. Being 8 years old, my mind didn't consider anything but him being found alive. What did he say? Where is he? Why didn't he call? I asked these questions in such a rush. My brain was tripping over itself for some answers. My dad just looked at me and said, "He's dead, Riley." There was no more conversation on that ride to my grandmother's house. My dad bought me some food before we got there, but I was numb. I wasn't hungry. I went to my Aunt Zoe's room after putting my food in the fridge, and she was a wreck. At this point, she didn't have a lot of information about what happened because my mom, grandmother, and my other Aunt Haley hadn't come home. I just sat there with my aunt and cried while her friend consoled us. Brody was pacing up and down. He was 14 at the time and he was extremely quiet. When my mom, grandmother, and aunt got home, we got the rest of the horrific story. After missing for almost 7 days, Jared's body was in fact found in a river. He was found by a mute fisherman. This stunned us because of the dream Kylie had had. Jared's body was bloated and partially decomposed. My mother said that she will never forget the smell or the way his face looked. His eyes were almost hanging out of his head. It was horrible. Fish and other sea life had already started nibbling on him. My family was only able to identify his body through the clothes he was wearing and a strange mole that he had on his shoulder. He looked nothing like himself. My mother had noted that it looked like he had his throat slit. My uncle's car hadn't been found, and the police were conducting their investigation. We had so many questions. Who would hurt my uncle? Why would someone hurt him? Jared's body was in such an advanced stage of decomposition that the coroner could not conclude an exact manner of death. He instead gave us a list of possibilities. These included strangulation, a severe blow to the neck, drowning, or having his throat slit. The next few days were a blur, but eventually the funeral came. Due to the state of decomposition and such, my family was not allowed to have Jared's casket open at any time. We were not able to see him after the initial identification. I'll never forget walking into the chapel. It was like walking into a wall of camphor. The smell was overpoweringly strong. They had wrapped my uncle up more or less like a mummy and filled the coffin with camphor balls because the smell of decomposition was so bad. The funeral passed, and my family was a bit lost. All of us. A couple of days after the funeral, the police called my grandmother to inform her that they had arrested 4 men days prior on the 30th of August. The police told us that one of the men, who was actually not a man at all, as he was a 16-year-old boy, broke down and told them about Jared's murder. The 4 men, who were in fact from Bonaire, were arrested for an unrelated crime. During the interrogations, the 16-year-old cracked and admitted to being present during the killing. I will now tell this part of the story as we were told. In April of 2002, during a poker game, one of the men was asked by a friend if he knew where he could get some parts for his car, which happened to be a rare older model car. The man told him that he would find him car parts and not to worry about it. Realizing he had to steal a car to get the parts, he pitched the idea of stealing a car to the other 3, and they began looking. Jared had the same kind of car, and it was in pristine condition. After they spotted him working as a taxi driver with the car, they decided to steal it. Their plan was to pose as a group of passengers and all get in the car. They put their plan into action, and on the night of August 27th, they struck. Jared, being unsuspecting, picked them up and started driving them to their destination. On the way, 2 of the men pulled Jared into the back seat, while the 16-year-old, who was in the front seat, stopped the car, and another man got into the driver's seat. The 2 men in the back seat had my uncle on the floorboard of the car, and they were beating him. The 16-year-old told the police officer that my uncle was begging for his life. He told them to take the car and please leave him unharmed. He then told them about Kylie. He told them that she was only 6, and he loved her and he had to take care of her. He told them that he didn't want to die and leave her. The 2 men ignored Jared's pleas. One of the men took my uncle's belt off and wrapped it around his throat. The 2 men pulled the belt so tight that Jared's eyes bulged out and his neck broke. Even then, they continued pulling. They pulled until the belt snapped. At that point, they stopped the car and put his body in the trunk. The men then drove around in the car trying to find out what to do with the body. Eventually, they stopped at a gas station and bought some junk food and sodas with the $63 they had stolen from my uncle that night. After driving up to the countryside, around 4 a.m. they dumped the body off into the river and drove back. The men basically scrapped the car and sold it for parts. 3 nights later, on August 30th, the men attempted another robbery. The victim of this robbery played dead after the beating, and when they put him in the trunk of the car, he opened it and leapt out. They were arrested that same night after the man called the police. My uncle was brutally murdered for a car. The 16-year-old got put into witness protection, as he is a state witness, and the other 3 were sent to prison. I think the worst part of Jared's story was hearing from my mom that these men were laughing and smiling in court. They actually looked at my family and laughed. That infuriates me to a point I can't even describe. My cousin is an adult now, and we are still very close. She is like my sister. A few months ago, we were having a sleepover at my house, and she told me something that broke my heart. At 2 a.m., in the darkness of my bedroom, she confided in me that she could no longer remember Jared's voice. I silently started crying. Kylie had grown up to be such a beautiful young woman. She's smart, she's quiet, and she's fierce. Upon hearing her say that, I hugged her and told her that I would always remember for the 2 of us. I can't forget. It took 11 years, but in 2013 the men were finally tried and convicted of the murder of Jared. They received life in prison, but appealed the sentence and got a shorter conviction. My story does not end there, unfortunately. 10 days after my uncle was found, on the 13th of September 2002, another one of my uncles, Matt, passed away. It was my grandfather's birthday, and Matt had gotten a promotion at work that same day. Matt was on the highway driving home when his car ended up going over the divider separating the lanes, and an 18-wheeler cargo truck ran over the car. Matt's body was completely destroyed. A metal pole went through his forehead and came out the back of his head. Some parts of his body looked like it went through a meat grinder. It was horrible. Family members got to see Matt's body on the day of the funeral. The funeral home tried their best to make him presentable, but honestly, he looked nothing like himself. We were not allowed to touch him because some parts of his body were missing due to it being destroyed by the accident. They tried to patch up his forehead where the pole had gone through, but it was obvious. It was heartbreaking. Matt was only 22 at the time of his death. My grandfather, who was 52 in 2002, never fully recovered after Matt's death. He developed a myriad of health problems. He had a nervous breakdown in the days after this incident. My story, again, does not end there. A little more than a year later, on April 26, 2004, I went to my grandmother's house after going to my great-grandfather's funeral that day. I saw my grandmother, who told my aunts and I that my Uncle Brody was going to a job interview. My mom and I visited for a while, and eventually left to go home. My parents were having problems, and I developed some resentment towards my mother for things related to the unrest in my parents' relationship. That night, we got a phone call from Aunt Haley. My Uncle Brody had gotten shot. She didn't know how bad it was, and he was at a healthcare facility. My mother immediately became distraught and was sobbing. She just kept telling my aunt to please tell her that he would be okay. She kept repeating that this couldn't happen. We ran out of the house, jumped into the car, and started driving to the healthcare facility. My mom called my dad in the car and told him what happened. About 7 minutes into the drive, my mom got another call from Haley. Brody was dead. My mother started screaming to my aunt that it couldn't be true, and my aunt was equally as hysterical. My mother hung up and started calling people to tell them that Brody was dead. I remember being so annoyed because every time she would call someone and said it, she would scream it hysterically, eventually end the call, sob silently, and repeat the process. I took the phone from her and threw it in the back seat. Then I told her to focus on driving, otherwise she would get us killed. We got to the healthcare facility, and all of my family members were in their cars. Everyone was sobbing, and most were hysterical. In the backseat of Haley's car, my grandmother sat quietly weeping. My heart broke for her. I grew up with my grandmother. She was like my mother, and Brody was only 6 years older than me, and he was like my brother. I went to my grandmother and I just sat there with her and we both cried. Brody was only 17. All we knew was that he had gone to an interview after school for a grocery store job. While we were sitting in the cars waiting for an official, my grandmother told us what she knew. She was at home baking bread for Brody's dinner when the neighbor called. The neighbor told her that she had heard that Brody was shot, and which health facility he was at. My grandmother, thinking that he would be able to come home, told my aunt to put the bread in the oven for him because she wanted him to get some when he got home. My grandmother, who had lost so much already, couldn't fathom the idea that her baby boy was dying. As soon as she walked into the health facility, she saw a man walk out of the room and he said, "He's dying right now." She ran over to him and explained that it was her son, and the man let her go into the room. She got into the room the same time my uncle took his last breath. She told me his body was still warm, and she hugged and kissed him and told him that she loved him. I think it's important to state why I didn't say hospital. The healthcare facility was the closest medical facility to the place where Brody was shot, and a friend of the neighbor, who witnessed part of the events following the shooting, carried him there. An ambulance was called, but Brody died before it got there. The official came to speak with my family. We were allowed to see Brody one last time before he was taken to the morgue where we couldn't touch him. After that, a police officer told us to follow him to the police station where the events would be explained to us. Again, I'm going to explain this part of the story as it was told to us. After Brody had finished the interview, he met up with this girl he had met, Farah. She was a teen mom and Brody had gotten the job interview to help her buy the things she needed for her baby. She was poor, and she told him that the father of the baby neglected the child, and that sometimes she couldn't afford to buy diapers and formula. I had personally met the girl a few weeks prior. She came to my grandmother's house and Brody had taken her into his bedroom. The door was left open, and being a nosy 10-year-old, I listened in on the conversation, as did Brody's best friend Aaron. Farah was telling my uncle that she was starting to like him, and asked if he wanted to be in a relationship with her. Brody told her that he would prefer being her friend. He expressed that he would get a job to help with the baby, but that he would be a supportive friend and not a boyfriend. She expressed her disappointment, and there was a brief pause. I looked in to see my uncle hugging her. He told her that he cared for her and her daughter, but only as a friend. Farah left soon after, obviously disappointed with the situation. He had planned to meet up with Farah after the interviews to get some CDs back that he had lent her. A few seconds after their conversation ended, the father of Farah's baby, David, walked up to Brody and hit him. Brody was confused and asked him what his problem was. David replied that he didn't like the way he was trying to get with the mother of his child. My uncle tried to tell him that that wasn't the case, but David wouldn't listen. He started hitting him, and Brody defended himself. Brody was more or less winning the fight that he never wanted. When David realized this, he pulled out a gun and shot Brody in the chest. That's when Brody started running. There was a police officer down the street, and Brody ran over to him and pointed to David, saying that he shot him. At that point, David was trying to run away, and the police officer gave chase, and Brody tried crossing the street. He collapsed, and that's when the friend of the neighbor realized what had happened. He put Brody into the car and took him to the healthcare facility. The officer that chased David caught him, and during the interrogation, he said that Farah had set the whole thing up. Apparently, she told him that Brody was approaching her for sex, and that he should teach him a lesson. That little bitch cost my uncle his life. I immediately stood up and I said it was a lie. I had heard Brody tell her that he didn't want to be with her. I told the officer about her coming to the house and about Aaron and I eavesdropping. He informed us that David was caught with the gun and everything, so he was being charged regardless. That night we all went to my grandmother's house. Around midnight, Farah called on the house phone. She didn't identify herself, but we knew it was her. She asked to speak to Brody. My grandmother simply said that Brody couldn't come to the phone right now, and hung up. I held her after she had hung up and told us what happened. The next few days were all just visits to the funeral home and then back home. The funeral came, and I don't remember most of it. It seems like a dream, to be honest. My grandmother had a nervous breakdown, coupled with an emotional breakdown. She wouldn't come out of the room for days at a time. I would just hear her sobbing. They were broken, heartbreaking sobs, ones that I wish I never hear again. You could hear the absolute pain and agony. The silence was worse, deafening silence, just the nothingness of it all. She was 48 years old when Brody died. My grandmother is a strong woman today, the strongest I know. She just turned 60 and is retired. She calls me on most days, and we talk about everything. In some ways, we clung to each other after Brody's death. The three of us were very close, especially after Jared's death. April 2016 will be 12 years since Brody was shot, and the case just only started on the 4th of January 2006. My final story is about my dad. On May 23rd, 2008, he got into an accident. I was 14 at the time, and my dad was 36. I was going through my rebellious stage, still harboring that resentment towards my mother. It was just after lunch break. The bell rung to signal that classes were about to start when the school nurse came to get me. She told me that my grandmother, my father's mother, was on the phone. I immediately asked if something had happened to my father. She hesitated, and I knew. I just knew. I went to the office to speak with my grandmother on the phone, and it was actually my godmother. She told me that she was on her way to pick me up from school, and that my dad was in critical condition at the hospital. When my godmother came to pick me up, I immediately started asking questions. She didn't know a lot, however. We got to the hospital, and I started looking for my grandmother. When I found her, I knew it was bad. My dad's entire side of the family was there, even the ones that lived hours away. I was told that my dad was in surgery, but that things didn't look good. My grandmother told me to call my mom and tell her to get there as soon as possible. I called my mom, and she said she would be there in 15 minutes. We were all sitting in the waiting room. Some people were crying, but my grandmother and I were dry-eyed. As harsh as it sounds, I have grown somewhat numb to death. I can no longer cry externally. I just sat there, feeling like I was slowly suffocating. My grandmother told me that my other godmother, who is a surgeon, was in the operating room. Then she told me what she knew. At 6:30 a.m. while on the bus, she saw my dad get into his truck. That's when she called him to say hi and whatnot. She talked to him for a bit, and then she had to get off of the bus. The call was ended, and she went to work. At 8 a.m., she got a call that my dad had gotten into an accident while riding his motorcycle. I should explain that my dad had a car business as well as another job. He was in the military in my country, but he would be gone a lot for his car business. His motorcycle was on the military base, and he had switched vehicles. My dad loved motorcycles. He had since he was a teenager, and he was a very good driver. He had pulled out of the facility near the base when a taxi stopped for him to pull out into the lane. While pulling out, another driver, who was an absolute idiot and couldn't seem to wait the minute and a half that it would take to pull out, overtook the taxi and sped up, hitting my dad and launching him 30 feet into the air. After he hit the ground, he got up, took 2 steps, and asked the driver if he didn't see him. He collapsed at that point. My grandmother told me that when she had met the ambulance, she saw a lot of blood on the sheets that were covering him. He tried talking to her, but he couldn't. She told him to be strong and hold on. He started crying at that point. My grandmother refused to cry. She instead told him that he wasn't alone and that she would not let anything happen to him. They took him into surgery after that. She was told by officers that were on the scene that my dad unholstered his gun and handed it to them before asking them to call her. He recited her phone number, and an officer called. While waiting for the ambulance, he told the officer that he couldn't feel his legs, and that the taxi had stopped for him. At this point, about 2 hours had passed, and a surgeon called my grandmother down the long hallway. My dad didn't make it. As I sat there on the floor, everyone around me sobbing uncontrollably, my aunt even fainted. I just thought of seeing him the day before. He had come to see me, promising to take my friends and I to the mall. He had cooked me my favorite food, and before he drove off, he pulled on my nose and asked me if I loved him. I replied yes with a smile, and he drove off waving with a smile on his face. It was our thing. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I couldn't feel anything. We were taken to see his body. My godmother, the surgeon, told me that he refused to close his eyes. She told me that he opened his eyes, looked at her, and took his last breath with tears running down his face. I think about that a lot. It turns out that my dad had broken his spine, 1 arm, and 2 legs. He also had a skull fracture, and his pelvic area was absolutely destroyed, and the carotid artery was ruptured there. The only part of his body that did not sustain an injury was his chest, and that's because he was wearing a bulletproof vest. I truly have no idea how my dad took those 2 steps after the accident. I also don't know how he was coherent enough to give an officer his gun or say anything. The man was charged with vehicular manslaughter. My grandmother also sued him, but I'm not sure what is happening with those proceedings. I don't really want to know, as harsh as that sounds. The days following were hard. My dad's side of the family was hard on my mom. I was too, because of my resentment towards her. She cried constantly. My dad was a strong man. He was tough. I want to remember him that way. He was invincible to me. I think he thought so too. My parents were together 23 years. They were 13 when they got together. My family has been through a lot in the past 14 years. I didn't think that we would ever reach a place that we were able to cope with it, but we have. I also speak to my other grandmother almost every day. She's also the strongest woman I know. She ties with my other grandmother. My dad was her only child. I'm all she has now, and I love her with all of my heart. She's one of those rare people who cares about everyone. Even with losing my dad, she still gives so much of herself to everyone. Always make sure to appreciate your loved ones and hold them close. I would give anything to hug my 3 uncles and my dad again. I can never do that again in this life, but I will always remember them. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you check the description for information on how to submit your stories. Before I end this video, I would like to let you know that I can personally verify all of these stories. With this story submission, they included photos of the actual newspaper clippings. They did, however, ask me not to show those, just to keep their family's privacy. I would also like to add, the person who submitted the story about the Samoan rugby player emailed me back with a link to verify the story, so I'll include that in the description if you would like to read more into it. I'll catch you guys in the next video, and just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. This story was submitted by John. I had an experience that I cannot report to anyone and would like to put it out there. It could save someone. There's a serial killer out there. In 2012, when I was 24, I lived in a small rural town called Chatsworth in the state of Georgia. It borders vast wilderness and mountainous areas and has lots of forests nearby. When I was 18, I made a few mistakes that I'm not proud of. I had slept with a 16-year-old girl, and so I have to register as a sex offender for the rest of my life. It's no big deal, but this comes into play later. The only other person I ever associated with was also a registered offender, a man named Fred. Fred worked at the carpet mill with me, as it's the only work to be had in this small town. Fred was older and a bit creepy, but I would put up with him because he would drive me to work and drop me off at home quite often. Usually on my days off, I would go jogging what we call the circle during the night hours. It's a sidewalked path that circles around the rec center and swings by the library. I'm not really supposed to be in proximity because of nearby schools, but there was never any problems and no one really bothers anyone where I live. One day Fred was driving me home, and he seemed paranoid. He kept watching cars and asking me if they made the same turns as he did. He said he was trying to figure out if he was being followed. I told him that I hadn't really noticed. I'm not one of those tough guy types like he was, nor am I prone to any real paranoia. Not then I wasn't anyway. Fred went on to tell me that there were rumors of strange disappearances in Chatsworth and the surrounding cities, particularly sex offenders. I told him, "Relax, dude. You're just being paranoid. People take off and don't register all the time." To which he responded quickly, "Exactly." He was starting to sound a bit crazy, so I just listened and didn't offer any more input. Then he went on to say, "And if no family members report them missing, it is no criminal offense. They take out a warrant on them, not even a search and rescue. There is no investigation into the disappearance like a normal citizen. Then he went on to tell me that he had thought he was being followed a few times by the same vehicle, a dark green SUV, and that one night the GBI had watched his home for the night, informing him that there had been a strange rise in the absconders, sex offenders that flee registration or disappear, and that due to this fact, they would be conducting random stakeouts to try and figure out what was happening. I told Fred that they probably just shook him up and now he was reading too much into it. Then he dropped me off and I went on my usual routine in my small single-wide trailer. As I browsed on my laptop, it quickly occurred to me that anyone could get online and find all of my information. Where I live, work, past employment, everything. It is all public information. Of course I already knew that, but if anything was occurring, there would be no real way to escape for me. I shrugged it off. Fred is a bit weird anyway. I don't even know what his offense was, but I doubt it was as innocent as mine. I didn't even want to know what he did. A couple of weeks go by as normal. I had almost forgotten about Fred's weird stalker. Then he told me something that gave me shivers down my spine. We were driving to work and he was recounting an earlier conversation we had. When I was at his house about a week earlier, we had a couple of beers and heard a car engine running outside. He had told me it was probably his landlord's generator, that he hears it every night for a while, sometimes several times per night. Well, he told me that he looked outside for some reason at around 4 a.m., and there it was, the dark green SUV. It was just sitting in the dark, running in the road, no headlights on or anything. He said that the noise was the vehicle that had been following him. Then he told me that he thought someone had been in his house while he was at work, and that some things were missing, though he wouldn't tell me what. It seemed like things he didn't really want anyone to know about. He also told me that his landlord confirmed that he hadn't run his generator but a couple times that whole month. Fred's paranoia got worse. Then it got better. At first I could tell he hadn't been sleeping over the course of many days. He would say things like, "He's toying with me. The fucker. I know it." Then one day a couple more weeks later, he told me, "I guess I lost that psycho. No problems for over a week. Thank God." I was a bit relieved. I don't like anyone under that sort of stress, real or imagined. A few days after that conversation and no more mention of it, I had just gotten back from my usual jog and noticed that my living room light was off. I know I left it on. Hell, maybe it just blew out. But then as I approached the door, I saw one of my flower pots had fallen off of the porch. It looked like it had gotten bumped off. I still didn't think much of it because there are neighborhood dogs that roam around. Maybe one of them knocked it on my porch. The front door was still locked, exactly as I left it. But as I entered my home, I knew something was wrong. For one, the living room light worked. My laptop was shut, and I never shut my laptop because the screen hinge is broken, so I always left it open. But someone else wouldn't know that. I was afraid. Fred must have been the culprit. I knew it. That paranoid sick freak is now messing with me. Who knows what he wants to do to me? The next day went like normal, but when he picked me up for work, I didn't say much to him. But he acted normal, like he always does. I kept studying him for clues for the next few days, but all was normal. One night on my jog, I had the eeriest feeling that I was being watched. I slowed to a walk and started to cross the baseball field, approaching the library. The tree line of the woods was about 100 yards away, and in the dark as I was scanning across, I saw something. A leg. My heart jumped and I noticed the outline of a person standing on the edge of the woods. I could barely make him out, but I could see he was holding something up to his face with both hands. It reflected the streetlights for a moment. I just kept walking, but at a faster rate. This man looked tall and thin, not short and fat like Fred. I really can't picture Fred going through all the trouble to walk out there anyway, especially in the dark. Who does that? When I got back to my trailer, I decided to do some investigating. The keyhole had scratch marks underneath it, Some looked fresh, and some looked old. I had never noticed them before. Maybe they had already been there when I started renting the place. I don't know, but I didn't want to ask the landlord if something was damaged before I got the place. It just wouldn't sound right, so I just forgot about it. For a while. About a week later, I was waiting for Fred to pick me up for work. He was running late. Fred had his flaws, but he was always early, always the exact time. Fred was like clockwork. His entire routine was, and so was mine. I tried calling his phone, and there was no answer. Well, long story short, I ended up calling into work that day, and I never heard back from Fred. Ever. The following few workdays consisted of me calling a cab to and from work. One day my supervisor asked me if I had heard anything about Fred, and I replied, "No. The bastard left me hanging and quit his job without letting me know." "Well, we haven't really heard from him either, but his mother has been calling us and asking about him, and so is his parole officer." I didn't even know he was on parole, but this was enough information for me to become very worried. Everyone seemed to forget about Fred throughout the week. It was like he never even worked there. It was astonishing to really think about how someone could just vanish off the face of the earth without any concern being raised a week later. About half a month went by before the incidents began, again. Several times I knew someone had been in my home. I started getting many Facebook requests from outrageously hot women that wanted to ask me about everything in the world. I'm not even supposed to have a Facebook, so I deleted mine. Something weird was going on. Often my webcam light would just come on by itself. Sometimes my emails would be marked red, ones that I hadn't read. I changed my passwords, then they got rechanged. This happened many times, so I knew that someone was hacking into my accounts. The other IP addresses that logged into them showed other countries, so I knew that they were using proxies. The creepy happenings during my jogs continued. One night a man jogged towards me and he bumped me really hard. He was wearing a hoodie, so I couldn't really see his face, but the way he kept going, it seemed intentional, like he was messing with me. I saw glints of light in the bushes while jogging, but I dared not to investigate them. A different night on my jog, everything seemed normal, until bright headlights came flying down the road, a road that is a school zone. You don't fly down this road. It is between a high school, a library, and a hospital, and it's right near the police station. This vehicle flies up, and I see that it's a truck, I think. And just as I think it's about to zip past, it brakes hard, and there's a bit of a screech from the tires, and the high beams flick on. I can't see anything. Then it slowly creeps by. I have this overwhelming feeling like a shark is circling me. As it passes by, I see that it is a dark green SUV, a Chevy Trailblazer to be exact. It passes by, and I never see the face of the driver. I immediately stopped going on my jogs. I'm not even supposed to be jogging that route, but it's never a problem, unless it's a problem, so I can't even really report this incident. But now things start to escalate. The online stuff and webcam light, hearing vehicles outside, and yes, it was the dark green SUV. I'm pretty sure it was the same one, just sitting there, except for one time. One time it was a PT Cruiser, black or a dark blue, just sitting in the road in front of my trailer. At first I was too afraid to look, but usually after I made it obvious that I was looking, he would speed off, so I decided to be more proactive about it. I didn't want to call the police because of the little things. Who knows who this is? Maybe he would leave me alone eventually. Maybe Fred just took off, and this is unrelated. It seemed like for a while, the more proactive I was about seeing who it was and getting to the bottom of things, the more he would flee and the less problems I would have. I began to research the absconders. The sex offenders who had moved and not registered to their addresses had almost quadrupled in my area in the past 4 years, and stayed that way with some minor variations over those 4 years. I searched for missing persons in my area, and Fred was not listed. 6 of the people that were listed over the past 4 years were also absconders of sex offender registry. Before that, there were only 2 listed that were absconders. And if I went back 3 years before that, no listed missing persons were sex offenders. But as I thought about it, Fred wasn't listed. Who knows how many have gone missing? The number of absconders from the sex offender registry was 10 through 16 more than usual per year for those past 4 years. Hell, I thought, you're just being paranoid. Relax, or you'll end up like Fred. End up like Fred? How did Fred end up anyway? This was a rough time for me for sure, but it seemed like something I could easily completely forget about until something would happen. Then it was almost harmless enough to creep me the hell out, but then I could almost forget about it. I went back on my jogs, and for a while, I had no more issues during my night jogs, until the night it happened. I was approaching the area between the library and the local hospital at about 3 a.m. Anyone from Chatsworth will have a clear picture in their mind of this area. Catching my breath, I slowed to a walk, taking in the serene stillness. The cool air rushing down my throat, the steam of my breath, my heartbeat, all the while looking towards the hospital, the only thing with any sort of activity. But there wasn't anyone outside at the moment. It was so still, so calm, so deserted. Deserted, other than the parking lot behind me, which I had already passed. Someone had left their vehicle there. The vehicle I saw a couple minutes previous and paid no much mind to. Wait, that was it. The SUV. Was it? I went to turn around and see, and I felt something pop. Something hit me in my right butt cheek. A man approached, not walking directly from the vehicle, but from the direction of the woods. Sort of. I'm shocked, and I look at my now burning numb backside, and there's a large projectile. A dart with a colored fuzzy ending protruding from my back pocket. I was trying to run away and remove the dart, realizing it was stuck in me through my pants. I was fumbling and stumbling, and it began to get harder to focus, and really hard to hold myself up. Everything was getting heavier, and if I could just make it to the hospital, if I can just get up to the road and cross it. I keep looking behind me, and then back to in front of me. He's getting closer, and the road seems further and further away. I just can't make it to the damn road. How am I even going to get to the hill leading up to it? What am I doing? Where am I? Things keep getting more and more distant. I have some vague memories, I think, of being carried, of being rolled on something metal that I'm laying back against. Something with wheels at the bottom, but upright. I had some vague memories of sitting in a passenger seat watching streetlights go by. Then a lot of trees. A lot of trees for a long time. Then dirt roads, and then mountain roads. Being rolled up on this thing again, and then someone talking to themselves. Maybe to me. I can't really tell. Everything is so incoherent. I have some dreams, though I can't remember them, aside from them being very weird. I awaken and it is still night. I'm just totally out of it. I'm restrained to a tree, and my pants were wet. Yes, I urinated on myself. Apparently. My hands are restrained above my head, and my feet are fastened together into the tree, and I'm very hungry. I'm sore in multiple places, and I can tell that I've been beaten a bit. After coming to my senses, I realize I'm on a trail, tied to a tree. There's a table set up in front of me, with knives laid out, a sign hanging above the table, on the tree just in front of me. After spending quite some time trying to read it in the dark, I saw that it read something along the lines of,
"Don't worry, I will return."
I was scared to death. I've never gone through something like this before, or since. I'm a really nice guy. I would never intentionally hurt anyone. Why is this happening to me? I'm hyperventilating and I'm freaking out. I cry and I scream, but it's no use. Every forest sound I heard, I was thinking it was him. Then it wasn't. I couldn't tell what time it was, or how long I waited, and I couldn't get loose because I felt so weak, and nothing worked. Eventually I hear the sounds of an engine, and I start screaming for help as loud as I can, but the sound just goes away. Time just keeps going on, and then I get that overwhelming creepy feeling again. That feeling I had the entire time I was being stalked. It felt like the feeling of absolute evil hiding within the shadows of the unknown. I know it's him. He's nearby, and suddenly I hear a man's voice.
Awake yet?
I don't say anything. Not faking to be asleep, just not saying anything. It is dark though, and I guess he couldn't see me.
Fuck. I guess I killed him already. Now what the fuck am I gonna do?
He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was just pissed because he lost something and didn't have anything to do. He sets down a backpack and pulls out a package, a sack of something. It turns out to be rolling tobacco. He sits against the tree and rolls a cigarette. He's tall and skinny, but something he gives off is menacing. It's like how some guys you don't want to mess with because they're big guys, but then there's those few that are small guys, but you just know not to fuck with them. He was one of those. He wasn't big, but I could just tell he was a very intimidating guy. I could smell his cologne as he sat there, checking his phone. He was cussing something about a woman he was texting, and asking if she would see him again, or if she was done with him. I think he mentioned 2 different ones, but I can't remember. Eventually I have that familiar stinging burn inside my sinuses. Oh fuck, I have to sneeze. And then it happens. I sneeze hard and the man jumps to his feet, walking over glaring to investigate. I see his eyes light up with demonic-like enjoyment. Not like he's insane crazy, just really excited. No, this guy was in total control. Total control of everything. He knew exactly what he was doing, and it seemed like he had done this enough to be used to it.
Oh good, you're still awake. Still groggy?
It's still hard to remember all of it, but he went on having a very long conversation with me. He did almost all of the talking, and it pretty much revolved completely around him. He said that he had already taken my friend, and then he told me that there had been about 28 others before me. He talked as if this made him look like a god, not crazed like a lunatic. He bragged a lot about how smart he was, how he would use spyware to watch me at home, how he had been in my home many times, and how he knew everything about me. It was like I was talking to Satan himself. He was cunning and in control, drunk with power, and I was afraid, and he was getting off on it. I also remember that he had on a lot of hairspray, or perhaps mousse. He was a white man, maybe in his mid-20s. His hair was dark brown or black, and he styled it with distinctive spikes for bangs. His eyes lit up with total evil when he was happy, glowing with anticipation and malice. As the night went on, I told him that I'm not a bad guy, that I don't deserve this, and that he had the wrong idea, and the wrong person. He explained to me that he didn't care. He thought it was funny, and that I didn't understand. He wasn't mad at me. No. It would have been much better if it was someone angry with me. He was doing this for enjoyment. I went on. What are you going to do to me? Please, I won't tell anyone. I promise. He pulls out a knife shaped like a hook. Then he tells me that he will turn my face into a work of art. Then he would eventually be done with me. He didn't actually say it, but by done with me, I knew what he meant. He was going to kill me. This evil man was going to torture and kill me out in the woods, and nobody would ever know what happened to me. My family would never know. Nobody. I would be forgotten, just like Fred. I apologize that I don't remember exactly all the words. I still felt heavily drugged, and perhaps my mind tries to block out some of these terrifying memories. But I know he began to cut the left side of my face, slowly, and held my head still. He was savoring the moment. I could tell. He was trying to take his time and holding his urges back. I don't remember if he told me this, or if maybe I just knew. Eventually he said that he wanted to
save some for later.
He unlatched me, let me drink from a bottle of water, then gave me a candy bar. After crouching down for a while and gathering my strength, he let me take a piss. He told me,
"Don't even think about running."
I didn't have the energy to anyways. It hadn't even occurred to me to try. How could he be so normal with me? And not. After I relieved myself, he latched me back up to the tree in the dark, and he fumbled around for a bit. I could tell he was having trouble, the only time I ever saw him have trouble with anything. I don't remember him leaving, or me falling asleep. Maybe I fainted. I woke up and it was daylight, and he wasn't there. The table and duffel bag he kept his knives in were still there, and the sign was gone. Maybe he took it down the night before. I honestly don't remember. But wait, I'm in the kneeling position, feet still strapped, but my hands are loose. The wrist straps broke. They must have broken loose in my sleep. Maybe he didn't do them right last night. This was my only chance to get out of there, and I immediately took it. The crickets are beginning their sounds and the forest is getting darker by the minute, and it's starting to get late. I'm hurrying to rip apart the plastic wrap that is tightly bound around my ankles in many layers. I finally think I'm loose, and I start to jump into a sprint, but fall onto my face. Still a few more bands of plastic. I notice how sore my face is, the left side, and I feel the cuts that he carved into my face. I get my feet free and dash madly through the woods, not stopping. Even after it is dark, I keep running, tripping over briar bushes, hitting trees face first. I didn't care. I just kept getting up and running until I would hit something else. Eventually, after probably hours of pitch black dashing, I curl up into a ball and silently rest, unsure if I will ever awaken. Every sound scares the hell out of me. It's worse than a Friday 13th movie. This guy is menacing and smart. The next morning I make it to a farm, then to the local highway, the 411. I didn't even bother packing my belongings when I got home. I grabbed my wallet and essentials, left my computer and caught a bus to another state where I have family. It is hundreds of miles away from Chatsworth, Georgia. It still scares me though. I couldn't tell the police because I would have to explain too many things that I had screwed up on and done wrong, and I would probably end up in jail as well. That man is still out there. I doubt he has stopped. Someone like that doesn't just stop what he's doing. He can always get online and find me, no matter where I go. And I have a horrifying memory every time I look into the mirror. The scars on my face. His art. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you check the description for information on how to submit your stories. Now this story, just like all of my other stories, is claimed to be true. I personally think it's really far out there. There's a few holes in it, but things like this kind of do go on every now and then, so it could be that 1 in a million shot. I figured I'd put it out there and let everyone debate in the comments on if this is true or not. Like I said, it's claimed to be true, but I cannot verify this. So let me know down below, do you believe it? Do you think it was based on a true story? Just like my true Craigslist horror story? That was based on a true event, but it was embellished a little bit. Do you think maybe this story's the same? Or do you think it's completely fabricated? Let me know down below. I'm very interested in what everyone thinks. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. He was starting to sound a bit crazy, so I just listened and didn't How could he be so normal with me? And not. Right? Wrong. Right? Wrong. Right? Wrong. This happened almost 4 years ago in the early hours of New Year's Day. For reference, I was 17 at the time and in my senior year of high school. I'm a male, and I'm about 5'10" and weighed about 160 pounds at the time. I lived in the suburbs and I was at a New Year's party being held by my friend at his house, which was a 20-minute walk away from my house. It was about 1 in the morning and I was about to leave with another friend of mine who lived on the same block as me. My friend who was hosting the party asked if we would like a ride home, and in hindsight we probably should have accepted his offer. But our neighborhood was pretty safe, and we figured with the two of us walking together, no one would bother us. Plus there were probably other people at the party who needed a ride more than we did. We said our goodbyes to everyone and began our walk home. The road was predictably empty with no one but us walking along the sidewalk and maybe the occasional car passing by. It was pretty well lit though, so we weren't walking in complete darkness. My friend wanted to pick up a pack of cigarettes on the way home, so we stopped off at a gas station along the way. When we got to the gas station, it was nearly empty with only a woman at the pump filling up her car with gas and a guy posted up in front of the store on his phone. We went inside and my friend picked up a pack of cigarettes. We walked out of the store and my friend immediately lights up a cigarette. We reach the sidewalk and we hear someone behind us yell, "Hey, wait!" We looked behind us to see the guy who was in front of the store quickly walking towards us. He looked to be in his early to mid-20s. He was probably 5'8" and maybe 140 pounds from the look of him. He approached us and asked if he could get a light. My friend and I didn't think much of it and he lit the guy's cigarette. The guy thanked him and my friend said, "You're welcome." We began walking away again and the guy continued to follow us asking where we were going. We told him we were heading home and asked him where he was going. He said his friends were at a party and he was heading back over there as he left to get some fresh air for a bit. He asked if we wanted to come to the party. This is officially the point where red flags start going off with this guy. Why the hell would a guy in his 20s ask two teenage boys if they wanted to go to a party with him? We told him bluntly that we didn't even know who he was, nor did we know anyone at the party he was talking about, so we weren't going. He starts laughing and says that we seemed like cool guys to party with. He told us we needed to let loose a little. My friend and I told him that we were 18 and 17, to see if maybe that would get him to leave us alone. He chuckled and said that age didn't matter to him, that he had a brother who was 16 and he partied with him and his friends all the time. Jesus Christ, can this guy take a hint? I thought to myself. We were a little less than 10 minutes away from our house, and we didn't want this creep following us all the way there. I told him firmly, "Dude, we're not going anywhere with you. Now quit following us and screw off." He gets livid and starts screaming at us for being unfriendly, inconsiderate assholes, and that he was just trying to be nice. He then starts throwing racial slurs at my friend. It's probably worth mentioning by now that I'm white and my friend is black. My friend yells at him to get away from us before he cracks him in the face, and the guy proceeds to run away from us. My friend and I just looked at each other in complete disgust over what had just happened, and spent the next 5 minutes walking and talking about the creepy guy. We both agreed that he was probably drunk or high from a New Year's party. Next thing we hear a car behind us, and it proceeded to slow down to match our pace. We see the window roll down to reveal the guy that we had just seen a few minutes earlier, with who we presumed to be two of his friends. One of which was a man who was probably about the same age as the guy, and a woman in the back seat who had to be in her mid-30s. The guy tells us that we got off on the wrong foot, and asks us once again to join them at the party. My friend and I looked at each other, and I whispered to him that we needed to get away from them. My friend tells them that we're not going with them, and to leave us alone already. The guy was silent for a few seconds and said, "You're coming with us, one way or another." They pull over and quickly get out of the vehicle, which caused my friend and I to immediately go into flight mode. We turned right on a sidewalk and my friend yelled, "Run to the park, we'll lose them in there." We looked behind us and to our horror the three men were running right for us. We run into the park and we once again look behind us, and they're getting closer. We run into the dark, thick patch of trees that covered a good portion of the west side of the park, hoping to evade them. I was panicking at this point because I couldn't see a damn thing, and I was worried that my friend or I would trip over something and get captured by one of these sick freaks who wanted to do who knows what with us. We hear one of them trip and fall behind us yelling, "Fuck!" And luckily we see light again, and we make it to another path in the park and we make a left onto that path. We hear yelling behind us and one of the guys said that they lost us. The woman yells to split up and search around the park for us. We bolt towards the bathroom, which thankfully were open, and we hide inside. We took a minute to catch our breath as our lungs were practically burning at that point. We should have called the cops and just hid there until they got there, But at the time, we were so focused on getting the hell away from those crazy people that we decided to try and make our way to the nearest exit out of the park and run to my house. We waited for about 2 minutes and we bolted out of the bathroom and toward the park exit. Shortly after we exited the park, we heard one of the guys yell behind us that he had found us, and we were getting away. We looked behind us to see the guy in the distance starting to chase after us. We ran until we reached my house and I quickly opened the door. We ran inside, and I quickly locked it. We went into my living room and collapsed on the couch. We both sat there silently, trying to regain our energy and calm down after what had happened, hoping they didn't see where we ran to. I looked out the window several times over the course of 10 minutes, and thankfully they never showed up again. We talked about it, and we were glad that we were both okay and nothing bad happened to us. We were trying to figure out what they wanted with us. Did they want to kill us, rob us, have sex with us? God only knows. My friend hung around for another half hour before he insisted on heading home. He left and then I went to bed. I kept thinking about what had happened and pondered on what would have happened if they had caught me. Even as I'm recollecting this, I still have those thoughts. I eventually fell asleep and I woke and told my parents what had happened. They were thankful that my friend and I were okay, but were upset with us that we chose to walk home, and should have accepted the lift from our other friend or even called them, and they would have picked us up. Regardless, we filed a police report, and I gave them all the information I could. Unfortunately, we never heard anything about it again, and I wonder sometimes what the hell they've been doing ever since. I really hope they haven't harmed another person after that. I can't express how thankful I am that we managed to get away from those freaks, and to this day, this incident is still the scariest thing that has ever happened to me in my life. This incident definitely made me more wary of my surroundings, and I try my best to avoid situations when I need to walk late at night, whether I'm by myself or not. This happened 4 years ago when I was in college. It was around 2 a.m. at my friend's parents' house who were very laid back. And that's an understatement. Myself, my cousin Ted, and his girlfriend at the time, Holly, were snoozing in the living room. A phone goes off that wakes Ted and I, and see it's Holly's phone. Holly is in a deep, pot-induced coma, so we ignore it and go back to sleep. The phone continues to ring, so Ted finally answers it. They've never been shy of looking into each other's phones, but don't abuse the privilege. He says hello a few times before a male voice asked for Holly. Ted immediately hung up and got suspicious as to why a man was calling Holly at 2 a.m. He goes through her phone while I go to the bathroom. While washing my hands, Ted knocks on the door hard saying, "Hey, we need to take her home now." So I dry my hands and he wakes her up and we all get in the car and drive off to her part of town. Holly keeps asking Ted what's wrong and what's going on. Ted finally blew up about the call, emails he found in her phone proving she had been prostituting herself on Craigslist again, and that he was done. I'm as quiet as a crypt keeper, and she's bawling her eyes out and losing her shit trying to explain. We get to her house and before I can even fully stop the car, he tells her to get the fuck out and lose his number. She goes inside a snotty mess and we leave. When we pull up to his house, we sit outside in my car for a while taking in what had just happened, and giving him time to vent and tell me that this isn't the first time they've dealt with this. Out of nowhere, a black town car pulls up to the right of us and Ted says, "Oh shit." 3 people, 2 men and an older woman, get out and surround the car. I can see that the younger of the 2 men has a firearm. The woman goes up to Ted's side of the car and starts yelling at him to take his ass whooping like a man. I start freaking out asking who these people are as the woman starts trying to yank my doors and punch my windows. Ted says it's Holly's mom and her stepdad and her cousin. When the mom punched my window a 3rd time, I noticed the cousin laying his hand near his firearm. So I flight one and immediately put the car in reverse and drove backwards down the street to get away. I slid into a person's yard because of mud and kind of ruined their grass. I have since apologized and compensated for the damage, and took off when we see them run after the car and give chase. I had never been so panicked for my life. We're flying down regular roadways ranging 50 to 60 miles per hour. I'm running red lights, taking last-minute turns. I must have burned all the tread off my tires because my car skidded a good handful of times. They chased us for 22 minutes while the whole time I'm praying, where the hell is a cop when you need one? When we got to a quiet neighborhood I knew well, we turned down a street heavily covered in trees and Ted said, "Turn off your lights and stay off the brake." I do as I'm told and we roll down the street slowly. I stared into my rearview mirror as we saw them drive past the road that we were on, very slowly, but thankfully they didn't see us. When we were sure we lost them, I parked and started yelling at Ted, asking them why the hell they were chasing us and what was going on. As I'm having a panic attack, his phone rings and it's the mom. He answers and they say they want to meet and talk and get Holly's phone back. In the heat of everything, idiot Ted forgot to give Holly her phone back. I said I'm not meeting them without a cop present, so we tell them to meet us at a local gas station that we know cops frequent. When we got there, thankfully there was an officer on duty. They arrived 2 minutes after we did and Ted got out to deal with them in plain view of a cop and camera outside of the gas station. I noticed the cousin was not in the car when they pulled up. I couldn't make out everything that was said, but Ted handed over her phone. They talked for about 15 minutes with her flailing her hands, getting in his face, and even pointed at a cop in what looked like she was going to say something to them. When it was over, he got back in and we drove off. Apparently when we dropped Holly off, she walked into her house crying. Her family was up and immediately asked what was wrong, and Holly wouldn't say anything about it, just cried. So in their minds they jumped to the conclusion that Ted had hit her. She didn't even try to correct them. When he tried to show her mom proof of her ways, she completely rug swept and tried to make him the reason for all of it. I told him he was better off without that crazy and dodged a bullet. The next week was spring break, and we took a much-needed trip to Colorado. To give a little backstory, I am an 8404 Hospital Corpsman attached to the 3rd Marine Division 3rd Battalion. At the time of this story, we were stationed at an undisclosed location in Afghanistan. I have changed the names to protect those involved. Afghanistan is a place that not many people willingly go unless they have a screw loose, or are just lacking a screw altogether. I'm lacking the screw. I was a hospital corpsman, a combat medic for the Marines for those who don't know, stationed on a small shithole of a FOB in Afghanistan for 18 months. We were about 3 months into the deployment when the events of this story took place, and my perception of what was true was forever changed. It all started on the 4th of February 2012. First, let me introduce myself. I am Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class, FMF, Ellis, and I had been with my Marines for a little under 6 months at this point, but we were a tight-knit group. I woke up at around 2 a.m. that morning. We had just come back from a particularly nasty mission outside the wire and I was having trouble sleeping. I rolled off my cot. We didn't have rooms at this point, just a tent and some cots, and groaned, forcing the sleep from my eyes. It was cold, very cold. I stood up to my joints cracking and loomed around. So far, everyone was asleep. I pulled up my pants and my blouse and laced up my boots, pulled my leg holster on, buckled it and grabbed my rifle. I slowly made my way through the crowded tent and out the flaps that made the door. I knew I wouldn't be able to get back to sleep, so I figured that I'd knock out the mountain of paperwork I had to do. But first, nature was calling. Now, when I say a small FOB, I mean small. To go from the front gate to the rear chain link would take you no more than 20 minutes on foot, so going to the latrines from the barracks took a whopping 5 minutes. But in negative temperatures it felt like hours. I moved through the FOB as quickly as possible so I could seek the warmth of my office. I had made it to the latrines, did my business, and was moving back through the base when I got the feeling of being watched. It was a feeling I was used to, but this was different. I could feel whoever was watching me boring a hole in my skull. I brushed it off and moved to my office. Fast forward several hours. I had fallen asleep at my desk and was shaken awake by a Marine. I stood up and shook the sleep from my body. I looked at the young devil dog that woke me, Private Anderson. He was essentially my babysitter. "Hey, Devil, what can I do you for?" I asked him. He sighed. "Just figured I'd let you get some chow. We have a mission to do later. It's 0800 right now. Mission starts at 1500.
"What do you say?" he asks me. I smile slightly. "Yeah, sure," I say, and walk out of the building my office is in. It was warming up and I peeled the heavy Gore-Tex off and tossed it on my desk. We made it to the chow hall and Anderson grabbed my arm. "Hey, do you feel that?" he asked. I knew what he was talking about. The hair on my arms and neck were standing up. I felt it. We were being watched. "Yeah, let's go." I ushered him into the chow hall. The 4th of February, 2012, 1500 hours. We all stood outside our convoy, our gunny giving us our briefing. Unfortunately, I can't talk about the OPSEC and all. And it happens again. I get that feeling someone is watching. A chill runs down my spine. In my gut, I knew things were gonna get bad, but brush it off as nerves. Fast forward an hour and I'm jamming to One by Metallica while riding in one of the mine-resistant vehicles. We are in a canyon. The sun is high in the sky and everything is kosher. That's when time stood still. The next 5 minutes seemed to last an eternity. The IED went off under the truck ahead of us. The noise was deafening and the blast rattled my very core. Our driver jerked the wheel to the right and we went off the road. I was tossed around like a rag doll. That's when I heard it. The tiny sounds of bullets whizzing by us and ricocheting off the armor of our vehicles. My training kicked in. This was not the first and certainly would not be my last firefight. I kicked the door in front of me with all my might and it flew open. I lurched out of the opening and slid to a crouched position, taking cover as rounds whizzed by me. My ears still ringing, I could finally smell it. A mix of burning oil, flesh, and sulfur. I choked back a gag and looked around. Marines were all in cover and engaging the enemy who was positioned on a small outcrop a few hundred meters up the hillside. I peeked around the rear of my vehicle, aimed down my sights, slowly let my breath out, and squeezed the trigger. The fighter in front of me dropped, a red mist emerging from him. I pulled my head back as a few rounds peppered the sand where I was peeking out. Now the roar of the 50 cal was echoing. The fighting went on for about 20 minutes until it died down and eventually stopped. We had sustained 4 casualties, 2 KIA, the drivers of the truck in front of us, and 2 bullet wounds that had already been sent away on an evac. I checked ammunition and moved to the group of Marines that were formed listening to what Gunny had to say in regards to what we were going to do now. One vehicle was destroyed and the one I was in was busted up and unmovable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. I felt it. Someone was watching again. I glanced around checking my peripherals. All was well from what I could tell. I felt it before I heard it. It felt like someone jammed a red-hot fire poker in my left forearm and right thigh. Time stopped. I felt my leg give way to my body weight and I fell to the sand. Then the pain. It hurt. Oh, it hurt. I tried to move my hand, and could not. The next wave of pain hit me, causing me to yell out. Marines were firing at the area where the shots came from, and now I'm being dragged to a nearby rock. As I'm being dragged, I look down. My left arm from elbow down is crimson and my right leg is spurting blood. The thought, "I'm going to die here," flashed in my mind as a Marine started turning a tourniquet on my leg. Another wave of pain. Another scream. Lots of voices around me now. People applying pressure. Quick clot being applied. Then black. I came to 2 days later in a white hospital room to the sound of monitors beeping. I looked around, sat up, spun around and attempted to stand. My right leg gave and I caught myself on my bed railing. I had been shot multiple times. Once in the left forearm, once in the right thigh, nicking the femoral artery, which resulted in 3 blood transfusions because of blood loss. I was in Landstuhl, Germany. I got a Purple Heart for that, and 6 months of physical therapy. That was my last deployment. I was separated 6 weeks out of physical therapy. To the Taliban sniper who shot me 3 times, you had better hope we don't meet, because if we do, you will get to meet Allah a lot sooner than you anticipated. I am telling this story on behalf of my best friend Tom, who I've known since childhood and who I consider a brother. He served with the Army for several years as an infantryman with the 1st Battalion 75th Ranger Regiment. After he returned home from his combat tour in Afghanistan, he had more than a few stories to tell. However, I'm immensely sad to say that we lost Tom in a car accident recently. I know sharing a story like this is a strange way to honor someone's memory. However, there is one story from his time in Afghanistan that I always felt merited a submission. Tom would agree. He also visited Let's Not Meet occasionally, but never quite found the time to sit down and write about his experiences. There are many stories that will forever remain between me and him, but I know this one he always wanted to share. With that in mind, I'll do my best to pass it along. I want it noted that the details are somewhat hazy. It has been some time since his last recalling, in addition to the obvious OPSEC concerns. In 2013, Tom's unit was deployed to Afghanistan's Kandahar province. He was a private first class at the time and had been in the Army for a year by the beginning of his tour, with the last several months of that assigned to the 1st Ranger Battalion. He'd gone through immensely difficult training, up to and including jumping out of several perfectly good airplanes, to get where he was now, and as such was eager to finally do his job. He ultimately participated in 19 combat missions during his 4 months in country, all of them night raids aimed at capturing high-value targets, local Taliban cell commanders or other persons of interest. You see, the Rangers and other special operation forces specialize in nighttime operations. They train at night and operate frequently under the cover of darkness. The Taliban lacked widespread night vision optics, whereas each individual ranger was equipped with some of the finest nods money could buy and the accessories to complement them. With that advantage on top of their large numbers and superior training, it was hard for them not to feel like they owned the night when they went out on target. However, this wasn't always the case. One night, Tom's platoon was tapped for yet another HVT raid. After the typical briefing and preparation process, the 30 or so guys boarded the Chinooks and proceeded to the target location, disembarking under the cover of darkness to secure the area. Tom was a member of a 2-man machine gun team. His leader, Corporal Kyle, manned the 240 Lima machine gun. As his assistant gunner, it was Tom's responsibility to carry spare linked ammunition belts, call out fire adjustments, and act as a bodyguard to the corporal and his weapon should the enemy attempt to flank them. After leaving the chopper, Tom and Kyle moved to their designated blocking position, a vantage point in which a fire team can set up and interdict enemy forces attempting to enter or leave a target area. The target in this case was a small village, seemingly abandoned and heavily deteriorated, with crumbling masonry and multiple bombed-out huts.